Hello, this is Philosophical Rebellion. I want to talk about the Democratic Party today because a lot of the pundits are learning the exact wrong lessons from the 2024 election. And even in its aftermath, as Bernie Sanders and AOC are touring America on an anti oligarchy crusade, drawing massive crowds with the most passionate and inspiring rallies I've seen since Barack Obama ran in 2008. Yet we still have a bunch of centrist establishment pundits saying the Democrats need to become more like Republicans. Just a Republican light version that appeals to establishment centrists like Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. But those are horrible instincts, and that would be a terrible choice. Republicans like Liz Cheney don't have a home in the Republican Party, and they should not have a home in the Democratic Party. The Democrats need to promote an alternative vision to what MAGA and Donald Trump represent right now. And that means revolutionary political reform, like getting rid of the corruption that plagues Washington, D.C. But instead of embracing a revolutionary leftist politics, we have a bunch of establishment centrist Democrats who are telling us that we need to actually be status quo managerial candidates, and that the hill that we should die on is fighting for political institutions and norms that most of the American people view as failed institutions and failed norms. So, I want to talk about the history of the Democratic Party, because that will actually give us insight into who will have the better electoral chance: establishment centrist Democrats or a Bernie style revolutionary political agenda. So I wrote this paper called The Obama Era is Over. And I started talking about how the Barack Obama Democrats came into power with the biggest electoral mandate of any administration of the 21st century, including much bigger than Donald Trump has right now. Barack Obama ran on radical progressivism. He was talking about universal health care, pulling us out of stupid wars, kicking lobbyists and super PACs out of the Democratic Party, and creating a fair economy for all of the working class, saying that if you work a full-time job in America, you should not be poor. Needless to say, Barack Obama was an abject failure who did not deliver the progressive agenda he promised voters. Instead of even trying to attempt to fight for universal health care, he adopted a lobbyist-written, Mitt Romney-inspired healthcare proposal that charged Americans a tax penalty for not buying insurance from insurance corporations. We also had a situation where Barack Obama bailed out the big banks who were engaged in widespread fraud and had their businesses crumbling around them as a result of it. But instead of helping normal Americans who were being kicked out of their homes, Barack Obama rushed to the aid of Wall Street and the big banks to the tune of hundreds of billions of dollars, while leaving normal Americans out to dry. So what Obama showed the Democrats stood for was championing one thing, like radical progressivism, and then delivering something else: establishment centrism. So then the 2016 Democratic primary was really the test of where the party wanted to go. And Bernie Sanders was running away with it. But Hillary Clinton was Barack Obama's chosen heir to his administration to continue on his legacy of establishment centrism. And it was clear the American people did not want that. Hillary Clinton kept getting tens of thousands of less votes than Bernie Sanders. But the Democratic National Committee allowed superdelegates to have an outsized vote that allowed them to basically choose the party's nominee. So every time Bernie Sanders would get tens of thousands more votes than Hillary Clinton in a Democratic primary, they would leave the state with the same amount of delegates. And in addition to that, Hillary Clinton was allowed to use something called a victory fund, which was meant to go to the winner of the Democratic primary to use in the general election. But instead, the Democratic National Committee allowed Hillary Clinton to use that fund in the primary against Bernie Sanders. So, through a whole lot of corruption and anti democratic vote manipulation, the 2016 primary was gifted to Hillary Clinton after being stolen from Bernie Sanders. And what that meant was Hillary Clinton could not run on Bernie Sanders' extremely successful economic agenda that appealed to the vast majority of the working class. Instead, Hillary Clinton accused Bernie Sanders of being a racist and sexist for focusing on class and economic issues rather than racism and sexism. She sold the idea that you can only be a progressive if you focus on identity politics and cultural issues, and that progressivism does not mean being economically progressive. So then she went into the general election against Donald Trump. She tried to complain that he wasn't paying his taxes or that he was bought out by Wall Street and rich billionaire backers. And he was able to point right back at her and say, "You're actually the corrupt politician. You're the one funded by all these big money donors, and you do their bidding." And unlike Bernie Sanders, she was not offering actual economic progressivism, so she did not represent genuine reform. And she did represent the corrupt Washington establishment who are bought out by billionaires and big money donors and corporate lobbyists. So instead of Donald Trump's fake populism juxtaposed with Bernie Sanders' real populism, it was Donald Trump's fake populism against Hillary Clinton's clear corruption, as well as the establishment centrism that the Obama administration came to represent. Bernie represented the vision Obama promised but never delivered. Hillary Clinton promised more of the Obama administration, and that is why Donald Trump won in 2016. Hillary Clinton and the establishment centrists cost us the 2016 election, which I truly believe Bernie Sanders would have won if he was allowed to be the Democratic nominee. Unfortunately, 8 years of a Bernie Sanders administration was robbed from us by Democratic elites and never Bernie Democrats. So then next, in 2020, the Democratic primary was actually extremely competitive, with dozens of Democrats joining the race. Kamala Harris actually started out with tons of billionaire support, and after briefly surging past 10% in the Democratic primary, she soon fizzled out, eventually dropping out because she was on track to come 5th in her own home state. So while some candidates proved that they were not popular among the Democratic base, Bernie Sanders was once again surging to victory in the Democratic primary. And that's when the Democratic Party's oligarchs stepped in. Right before Super Tuesday, nearly 100 billionaires had joined into the Joe Biden campaign. And there's a Democrat named Adam Smith who explained the reasoning very well when he said it was not because Joe Biden was the best fit candidate to defeat Donald Trump, but because Joe Biden was the best fit candidate to defeat Bernie Sanders. So after receiving billionaire support and the endorsements of all of the other candidates that those billionaires had previously been propping up, Joe Biden narrowly eked out a victory against Bernie Sanders. But it wasn't all bad, because throughout the Democratic primary, Bernie had been resetting the narrative. Because before, the Obama Democrats ceded a ton of ground. So after years and years of concessions, Bernie Sanders was once again resetting the narrative to say we shouldn't be settling for the lowest of low-hanging fruit. We should be actually creating a better society for all Americans, bypassing the insultingly slow incrementalism that the establishment Democrats have been offering. And the rest of the Democratic Party was following Bernie. And that ended up meaning that Joe Biden required Bernie's endorsement to end up winning in 2020. And for that endorsement, Bernie Sanders got a lot of commitments from Joe Biden. They even created the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force to help shape Joe Biden's agenda. Unfortunately, when it came time to actually fulfill those commitments, Joe Biden was unwilling to raise the minimum wage, claiming that some unelected Senate parliamentarian was blocking that change, when in reality, he just chose not to do it. And when it came time to support workers on strike, like rail workers who were asking for paid time off when they received 0 days off. Instead, Joe Biden took away their right to strike, ordering them to go back to work without any concessions from the rail companies on paid time off. So Joe Biden once again lived up to the Obama legacy, promising one thing, genuine progressive reform, and delivering another of status quo management, establishment centrism. And people do not like that. But even worse, Joe Biden aided and abetted a genocide. He was an out and out racist against Palestinians. He spread purposeful propaganda with the intent to justify Israel's indiscriminate bombing, collective punishment through a siege, and intentional attempt to starve Palestinians to death, especially targeting water treatment facilities. When people like Bernie Sanders were saying, hey, we have these things called Leahy laws, Israel is in violation of them by committing war crimes, so under US law, it's illegal to fund Israel. We should stop funding Israel's war crimes. Joe Biden made it completely clear the United States would fund Israel with absolutely no red lines whatsoever. Joe Biden personally knew and said that Israel was indiscriminately bombing Gaza, then continued to send the bombs anyway. So not only did he fail to deliver on the progressive agenda he committed to with Bernie Sanders, he also refused to condemn the apartheid state of Israel while they engaged in a genocide, and he refused to enforce U.S. laws, both of which Bernie Sanders opposed and frequently criticized Joe Biden for. So many Americans were disgusted and sickened by Joe Biden, and he rightly became known as Genocide Joe. And that set off a Democratic Party rebellion against him. Over 1 million Democratic primary voters went out to their state's primary to cast a ballot for the Uncommitted movement, which said because of Joe Biden's complicity in genocide, they would not vote for Biden. But they were still committed Democratic Party voters who were willing to vote for Joe Biden with a change in his pro-genocide policy. And he absolutely refused to commit to any conditions on the military aid he was sending to Israel. No matter what war crimes they committed, no matter how many civilians they killed, didn't matter that they enacted a siege and said that they were going to block all food, water, medicine, and electricity from Gaza. Joe Biden was committed to it, 100%. So Joe Biden legitimately set off 1 million Democratic primary voters, and that alone was enough to cost the Democratic Party the election. But on top of that, Joe Biden was clearly in cognitive decline. Back in 2023, I wrote a paper called Why Biden Should Participate in a Democratic Primary. And in that paper, I cited that over 2/3 of the American electorate viewed Biden's cognitive health as not good enough to continue finishing out his term at the time. So it was clear that his mental health would be a decisive issue in the 2024 election. Yet instead of getting ahead of it and trying to make a ton of appearances and prove his cognitive fitness when there was time to have a Democratic primary, they lied and lied and lied. So by the time he finally went into the debate against Trump, they were exposed as frauds and liars. So at that point, I recorded a podcast, Dropout Joe. And in it, I argued that Bernie Sanders was by far the best equipped candidate to take on and defeat Donald Trump, because he should have been the Democratic nominee in 2016 and 2020 already. And he would have been had it not been for anti-democratic, corrupt tactics that the DNC and other Democrat politicians used against him, as well as the billionaire oligarchs and corporate lobbyists who have way too much power in our party. But the Democratic Party loves to shoot itself in the foot. And they did exactly that by undemocratically anointing Kamala Harris as the 2024 Democratic nominee without a primary process or any sort of say from the Democratic base. Remember, this was after her last show in politics was dropping out of the 2020 primary, coming in fifth in her own home state. So Kamala Harris did not earn the nomination. And actually, at the time, it was clear that she did not have a good chance at winning against Donald Trump. So I wrote a paper called Kamala Harris, Hillary Clinton 2.0, where I advocated for her to adopt the Bernie Sanders economic platform in order to appeal to his base, which her success completely and totally depended on. But instead, Kamala Harris chose to bench Bernie Sanders, move away from his economic agenda, and make her number one campaigning partner Liz Cheney. And it was at a time where you really had to be stupid to think that Liz Cheney was going to increase your electoral chances. So Kamala Harris completely turned her back on the progressive base who wanted Bernie Sanders' progressive platform. In addition to that, when it came time for her to address the Uncommitted movement, she basically said, sit down, shut up, and I'm going to do exactly what Joe Biden is doing. Unconditional support for Israel with absolutely no red lines whatsoever. And if you're not on board with that, that's because you support Donald Trump. So that was obviously not a winning message. Kamala Harris's Gaza policy likely alone could have flipped the election had she instead come out for human rights and international law rather than for continued support of genocide, which was also another change that I recommended in another paper called Kamala Harris and the Uncommitted Movement. So again, in every way that the mainstream Democratic politicians, this time Kamala Harris, moves away from the Bernie Sanders agenda, the less representative they have actually become towards their own base. And there's a reason for this, and it's really important, and it's because we have oligarchs controlling the Democratic Party. We have a corporate lobbyist problem in the Democratic Party. We have also, as a party, been corrupted by the history of Citizens United and all the various Supreme Court cases that have eroded our political system and allowed big moneyed interests to buy our politicians. So we actually need to fulfill as a party one of the campaign promises Barack Obama had in 2008. Which is to kick out the oligarchs and the corporate lobbyists and the big moneyed interests from our own party, completely swearing off super PAC money and billionaire money in any Democratic primary. Because Bernie Sanders is out there on an anti-oligarchy tour, and right now Donald Trump's government is a government of the billionaires, by the billionaires, for the billionaires. But we cannot honestly say that the Democratic Party is presenting an alternative to that when they are corrupted by the same billionaires and lobbyists that the Republican Party is corrupted by. So we need the Democratic Party to be willing to swear off the corruption. And that means swearing off billionaire money, swearing off corporate lobbyist money, and getting super PACs out of our primaries. And further than that, it's time for the Democratic establishment, the centrists who have been trying to appeal to the Liz Cheney voters instead of the Bernie Sanders voters, to finally accept that Bernie Sanders is the leader of the Democratic Party. And that's because he supports the policy positions that the vast majority of the Democratic base supports. But further than that, the Democrats only represent like a third of America, same with Republicans. But there is still an enormous unaffiliated segment of America. And not only does Bernie Sanders represent a huge, substantial part of the Democratic base, he also represents a huge, substantial part of the independent base. He's even gone on Fox News and called them liars and talked about his economic agenda to then receive standing ovations from the crowds that go to a Fox News town hall. So Bernie Sanders even has significant support among the Republicans in America today. But right now, the Democratic Party has proven time and time again that they will sell out their progressive base to then align with the establishment centrists and represent the interests of the big moneyed donors. That's what Barack Obama did. That's what Hillary Clinton represented. Then Joe Biden pretended again to support the Bernie agenda, only to backstab his progressive base once in office. So we are in a battle for the Democratic Party. But right now, and for the last several years, the establishment centrists have been in power, and they have been running the Democratic Party into the ground. So it is time for the progressive base, led by Bernie Sanders, to have a Tea Party styled progressive takeover of the Democratic Party. Or what I think would even be better, not just for progressives, but for all of America, is for Bernie Sanders to create his own third party, ideally pairing with something like the Green Party with 50 state ballot access. That way, in 2028, we could have a genuine left wing economic populist agenda and candidate to champion the values and policy proposals that Bernie Sanders has been fighting for. It really boils down to this. There's the wing of the Democratic Party that supports people like Joe Manchin and Liz Cheney. And then on the other side of the Democratic Party, there are people like Bernie Sanders and AOC. The Joe Manchins and the Liz Cheneys have way more power, and they have had more power than the Bernie Sanders styled Democrats. The elites of the Democratic Party have allowed a Republican like Liz Cheney to represent their values and dictate our party's priorities while turning their back on their progressive base. So it is time to oust those voices from the Democratic Party. So I've been writing a lot about Democratic politics, and I will link all of the papers I've talked about. So be sure to check out Democrats Did It to Themselves, The Death of the Democratic Party, The Obama Era is Over, and The Progressive Party of America on the Philosophical Rebellion Substack.